There you go. Hopefully I'm doing this right. And I think so. Okay, I think we are live.
I believe
And
so.
hopefully I'm doing this right. So when there comes any viewers on, do forgive me if I mess a little bit about. This is the first time I'm doing a live stream. We have actually 0 viewers, so that's great fun. But we just don't do this like a normal. If you're listening to this after we have recorded this live, just like I said, this is the first time I'm doing this, and because we reached 1,000 subscribers finally, about time you might say, and I thought it would be fun to do a live celebration on the YouTube channel. I have tried to share it, so if you are coming from other places, you're more than welcome, and of course, if you let's begin here by introducing, of course. Well, I should probably say welcome to That Aged Well. And like I said, this is our first live stream, and we're joined by Eastern Roman History from the YouTube channel. And welcome back. I believe technically this is the fourth time you're here, just technically.
Hello, it's good to be back.
We have one
And
listener.
pardon?
Welcome. We have one viewer. Welcome.
Yes.
But yeah, just go ahead. Yeah.
Oh no, it's good to be back, and I think so. But yes, it feels a while since I came on to talk about the Varangian Guard.
Yeah, 4 years now, I think. I think it was about 4 years.
Lord.
Yeah, you were one of the
I'll
first guests, top first 20 guests, I think. 25, 26, if I remember correctly. But things change, so here we are. And I want to begin because there's something that I've been thinking about recently, and that is, because Byzantine, or as it now fashioned to call it, the Eastern Roman Empire, and that's so it's been seemed to be a fairly recent scholarship that people is taking it more seriously just fairly recently, because it's up until even Cantor in the 60s, right? He looked at the Byzantines as lazy, non-knowledgeable Greeks, and in his book on the Middle Ages. And of course, it's a very Gibbonite view. But what do you think it has changed in these recent decades about that people start taking Eastern Roman history more seriously?
First of all, I think, well, that's a very good and interesting question. So I think in the 19th century, outside of certain points of view, the study of Byzantine history was taken quite seriously. For instance, in the German Academy, they created the Bonn Corpus, as it's called, the Corpus Scriptorum Historum Byzantinorum, and where a team of historians went in and edited a whole slew of historical texts about the Byzantine Empire, and French and Russian and sort of Balkan historians have been looking at the Eastern Roman Empire fairly critically for a long time. But in the English Academy, it's been kind of the realm of the antiquarian until John Bury in the turn of the 20th century. But then, even so, very much a niche of a niche. And I think during the 20th century, and particularly in the 21st century, in the last 30 years, or even in the last 10 years, I'd say, the interest and approach to Eastern Roman history has been very receptive of what it is and trying to take it on its own terms far more, and be a genuine interest in the subject, and also a lot of people's first first introduction to Byzantine history isn't Gibbon and isn't isn't through the lens of these very old preconceptions about it, and is far fresher, and so they can form their own opinions much sooner than people in the past did.
And even in the 60s, right, you had these historians, like I mentioned, Cantor, who really still has this Gibbonite view, as I call it, on Byzantine history.
I mean, I think in the school of the academy, academic history, Byzantine history has always been treated very soberly. And you've had lots of very accomplished historians like George Ostrogorsky, who was a Russian historian. You've had Ihor Shevchenko, another Russian historian, but also in the 60s and 70s, you had far more Western European historians and American historians come up as well, like Warren Treadgold, Judith Herron, and then in sort of for the earlier part of it in late antiquity, you've had Michael Whitby, Alan Cameron, and Avril Cameron.
And I believe one of the first translation of the Alexia, which we of course will come back to as well, was in 29. So it's fairly early on.
Yeah, I mean, I think the 20th century is really where Byzantine history has really started to be taken seriously as a field of study rather than a more kind of antiquarian interest. Like in the 19th century, the first real history of the Eastern Roman Empire on its own terms is in the English-speaking world, was by George Finlay, and even that is kind of like a passion project where this is something he wanted to do, and is restricted in some ways to the sources and literature he had available at the time. But it's kind of one of those big stepping stones along the way towards the far more serious approach that you have now.
Yeah. Dotrinius says, and we should remember about the pro-Greek sentiment among the British elite from the times of Byron as well.
So I think that's definitely true. Like, Gibbon was in that same sort of milieu in the turn of the 19th century. So, but people have still been interested in it for quite a long time. So, like in the Great a friend of mine was telling me about how in the Great Exhibition there was a exhibit of I think it was like a mock was it like a bathhouse or a palace, like the mock palace of Justinian, for people to visit in the 19th century. And then you've also in the Edwardian period you had the construction of Westminster Cathedral, which is in a Neo-Byzantine style, made out of brick, and the outside is all red and bricky, like Byzantine crossing square churches. But then the inside is where all of the finery and beauty is. So in there has been interest, and I think it's only kind of grown since then. But you do have this negative attitude towards it, where it's like, oh yes, you have these theocrats, these degenerates being led by scheming eunuchs, somewhat salacious women, and rather effete men. But
to be fair, though, they weren't really that much different to other empires of his time or since.
Oh no, and in fact, some of those stereotypes come from the Middle Ages themselves, like when the Crusades were happening, a lot of Crusaders viewed the Greeks, as they called them, as being effete, and they thought it was quite unmanly to have the nobility being perfumed and their hair all done up and stuff like that. And I think that kind of impression has continued from that point. But there's always been some interest in it. Like the first time, the origin of the word Byzantine was in the 16th century when Hieronymus Wolff was editing a whole load of Byzantine literature together for the first time. So there's always been a basis of interest, but kind of influenced by these preconceptions from the Middle Ages, if you like, and then kind of repeated again and again. And it's only in more recent times that people have looked more objectively at these things. And sometimes these things go in and out of fashion, like some popular, for instance, back in the Victorian era, there was an impression of the Crusades as being very negative, very self-serving, very kind of tongue-in-cheek in their actual commitment to the Crusades. And then in the later part of the 20th century, Crusader historians have looked at the actual sources and gone, actually, this is not the case. But that speaks to the societies that are looking at it, I think, a lot more than people realize.
And so what I find really fascinating is that it's one of the longest running empires in world history. I mean, it came from the age of Constantine until 1453, or if you don't want to be crazy and say 1923, if you consider the Ottoman successor, which is kind of the gray area there, but still, it is one of the longest continuous running empires in the world.
Oh, indeed. And although I think it's true that nothing lasts forever, you can do. I think the Byzantine Empire really proves that if through certain contrivances, you can certainly make a good go of it. And if you really want to take the Roman Empire in sum, it goes right. It spans 1,500 years from the age of Augustus to the fall of Constantinople. So its longevity is without question, really. Now, how you view that longevity as a kind of continuous decline over centuries, or kind of an ability to adapt and transform and go in and out of stages of prosperity and decline, then that's up to the individual. But I don't think there's any disputing the fact that the Byzantine Empire as a state was highly successucul.
And let's not forget as well, they survived. Let's see that the Umayyad. I'm super fascinated in Islamic history as well. But they survived the Umayyad Caliphate, the Abbasid Caliphate, Norman attacks, and Bulgar attacks. That survived pretty much the Crusades, more or less. If you consider that kind of the 1204 as kind of the turning point, but still they did survive all these threats that came. They threw at them.
And something I take pains on my channel to try and emphasize is the fact that despite the Fourth Crusade, the Empire did come back. And for 80 years, it was a upward trajectory from virtually nothing to the complete re-establishment of the Eastern Roman Empire in both Asia and Europe, and pushing into the various polities around it. And had circumstances been different in both the end of the 13th and middle of the 14th century, it's very possible that the Eastern Roman Empire would have survived after that point. I mean, I'm not under any illusions that it would have returned to the forefront of being one of the apex powers in the world, but as a regional power, it certainly would have had the opportunity to recover in some
And
regards.
you made a video that it did not, and of course I think this that's where Cardell is in his book as well, and his recent work, The New Roman Empire, as well, where they did not really end in 1453. They kind of lived on at least 20, 30 years more in the Trebizond Empire, as you made a video about recently.
Oh, indeed. That's the last main splinter state, which actually had a dynasty that descended from the Komnenoi. So if you really wanted, you could say that it all really ended in 1461. Speaking of Caudellus's book, I understand that you have been reading it recently.
I'm just halfway through, but I'm reading it currently, yeah.
What has been your impressions of it? I unfortunately have not had the opportunity to read it yet.
I find it fascinating. He certainly has views I was a bit surprised by. For example, his thoughts on Justinian is not very favorable. That he takes Procopius, and I want to discuss this in a second. He takes Procopius a bit more seriously than, say, some other historians have. For example, Saris, and I had him on recently. I didn't look up his name. David Parnell, for example, and Saris take Procopius with skepticism, but Caldellis seem to take him a bit more seriously than, say, other historians of the era, and he uses him a bit more when it came to the part of Justinian. But he was surprisingly Julian, as we talked about a bit earlier today before we went live. He was. I found Julian very intriguing, and he wasn't just this foolish pagan emperor. He actually was he seemed to be a fairly decent, and because of this, I've bought Philip Mansell's biography of Julian that I'm really looking forward to read as well. But what are your thoughts on Julian? Let's discuss him a little bit, because he seemed to be quite, from what I understand from Caldellis' point of view, he seemed to be quite a decent emperor, but he just got a bad rep because, of course, Christian authors labeled him a pagan.
Oh, well, they didn't label him a pagan. He was one, but
yeah.
From
Christian, obviously he was one, but Christian authors gave him a bad rep because he was a pagan.
Yes. No, I think. Let's try that again. I think Julian was generally a very earnest emperor in what he was trying to achieve. I think he genuinely cared about the people he ruled over. And I think had he lasted longer, he could have been a great emperor. I think an issue that comes with Julian is that because we know so much about his reign from historians like Ammianus Marcellinus, intellectuals like what's his name? Not Lactantius, Libanius, and his own writings, because we do have some of Julian's own writings, like his speeches in praise of Constantius, his Mossoponog, which is on beards, and a few other pieces of literature, and also various other historians and inscriptions and so on, that he's probably one of the emperors we know the most about from that period of history. But it's still, there are criticisms to be made of Julian, and even Ammianus Marcellinus, who was a he was a staff officer in Julian's army and a historian, so he would have been acquainted with him, and he's very much the hero of his history. He still has some criticisms of him. For instance, Julian banned Christians from teaching because he didn't want Christianity to try and influence people. And Ammianus comes down on this quite harshly, and I think it's because Julian is very sectarian, or trying to make the subject of teaching a sectarian issue, in that, you know, if you make it so that Christians aren't allowed to teach people, then what will the anti-pagan reaction be to that? So that's one of his big criticisms of him. Ammianus is also very keen to point out how Julian's very interested in the forms of paganism, like sacrifices. And he says that had Julian lasted longer, they would have run out of bullocks in the empire, because he was basically making sacrifices every day. But by that point in the mid 4th century, a lot of pagans of various stripes had stopped animal sacrifices in their worship. So in some ways, Julian is a little bit out of step with the religion he has converted into. Because Julian, remember, was not a pagan to start with. He was a Christian and was brought up as a Christian. And it's during his education and his early years he decides to convert from Christianity to paganism, hence his nickname, the Apostate.
Do you know why he decided to convert to paganism? If you can use the word convert in this case.
I think convert's the right word. Do I know why? I'm afraid I can't tell you. But
yeah.
But it is something that he kind of had to keep a secret during the reign of his cousin Constantius. But and it's something that was heavily he tries to set up essentially a pagan church during his reign. And in some ways, the way Julian's approach to paganism is from a very Christian mindset, where it's very structured. There are certain things you can and cannot do. He creates a pagan priesthood, essentially, but in the style of the Christian church almost, rather than the priesthoods of yesteryear. So you almost have the opposite of Constantine in a way, because he's the exact opposite in that he was a pagan who became a Christian, and then his approach to Christianity is kind of from a pagan perspective. And it's only quite late in his reign that he becomes far more prescriptive with how things should and should not be done. And Julian is the opposite, but doing very much the same thing, where he was a Christian and became a pagan, and then approaching paganism from a Christian point of view, which is why Julian's attack on Christianity is in some ways very effective, because he knows it through and through by the time he's emperor. So he releases people who have been heretics or disagree with his perspective on things.
What I found interesting about Julian is that he chose not to persecute Christians, but just let everyone have their faith in a way that he chose to leave everyone alone. It wasn't like, oh, I'm pagan, be going to make paganism great again. He wasn't like, oh, if you're a Christian, that's fine. We're not going to persecute you, but just be who you are in a way.
I think,
from what I understand, if I remember correctly, from Caldella's book, that is.
Oh, sorry. What was your
yeah, sorry. I was.
now,
I found it interesting how he chose not to persecute people who were Christian just because he was pagan himself, and he just let people be who they wanted to be and let them have the religion they wanted to have.
He's very enthusiastic in trying to buff other religions. Like he tries to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem for the Jews. He starts funding state. He refunds pagan festivals from the state, which had been cancelled by Constantius, and he releases the various Christian sects like Donatists and Arians and so on, which had been in conflict with the Nicene Christians, so they're all bickering with each other. But something that, again, Ammianus criticizes about him is that Julian, although he doesn't persecute necessarily anyone that's a Christian, he is kind of, if you like, has a two-tier justice system where he is very harsh with Christians who do things wrong, and then people that commit crimes against Christians he gives far more of a lenient hand to. And then Ammianus criticizes him for being unjust because he's letting his pagan fervor affect his judgment. But I personally think that Julian, although he is a very interesting character from history and certainly someone worthy of the amount of scholarship that has been written about him, he did only reign for 18 months, and his time as Caesar before that for about 10 years. 10 years? Slightly less than that. And it does suck in focus from the figures around Julian. So there is significantly less study of the sons of Constantine and also the Valentinian dynasty, because it kind of gets focused in on either Constantine and the Tetrarchs, Julian, or the Theodosians. And so the emperors surrounding Julian do get kind of forgotten about, both in academia and popularly.
Something I want to ask you about, and I'm going to have Caldella's on very soon once I read the book and we have decided on a date, so look out for that one. But still, I want to ask you about Procopius as a source and his secret history, because, like I said earlier, he seemed to be more in favor of Procopius, unlike, say, Justinian's biographer Cyrus. He is skeptical, and David Parnell is as well skeptical to Procopius. And of course, you haven't seen like where she's personally did not Theodora, but Antonina did a Woody Allen, where she had an affair with her stepson. And but
do you mind if I ask what you mean by more favorable towards Procopius?
That he is taking him more seriously. That he is kind of he used him more as a source for Justinian and Belisarius, and he took him more seriously, basically. And but what are your thoughts on Procopius as a source of the secret history?
Well, Procopius is the historian for the reign of Justinian, and I mean that in the sense that not all, but a huge amount of the information we know about the reign of Justinian and a little bit before comes from Procopius through his History of the Walls, his Secret History, and also his book about the buildings. But it's not the only source of history for Justinian. There's Agathias, who picks up where Procopius leaves off, because I think Procopius finishes his History of the Walls in the 550s, and then Agathias completes that decade. But he, as I understand it, dies before he finishes his history. And then we have the history of Menander the Guardsman, who writes about the end of the final couple of years of Justinian's reign, and then the reigns of his two successors. So we've already got 3 historians for Justinian, and then there's John Malalas, who is if you like, the rival for the history of Justinian, but he is writing a very different type of history. He's writing a Christian world chronicle, whereas Procopius is writing very much a classicizing history, as they're called. One very much in the vein of Thucydides and Tacitus and people like that. Whereas Malalas is writing in the vein of the Old Testament, where it's like, well, the Book of Kings and Book of Chronicles, and in this year, Justinian did this, and so on, stuff like that.
It feels kind of like Procopius is more anti-propaganda for Justinian and Belisarius than it is actual history from my point of view, that is.
Well, Procopius admits that he, in the secret history, that in his History of the Wars, he's had to leave things out that he would have wanted or could have included when he wrote the secret history. So there is the trouble with any historian writing about the emperor they are living under, is that there is that element of you do need to be careful, because if you criticize the emperor too much, you could get into trouble. And some historians had tried doing this in the past, like the church historian Socrates writes about his reigning emperor, but it's very much he achieves that by writing in a very different way, where it's very much more like a speech of praise than the rest of his church history. So Procopius kind of, if you like, edits out significant points of criticism and leaves it for his secret history, which is then... So the secret history is a bit like a prosecutor's character assassination, if you like, where it's everything and the kitchen sink is thrown against them, where you get the fanciful things like the Justinian removing his head because he's a demon and wandering around the palace, with genuine points of criticism like ceasing to pay the frontier soldiers, the Limitani, because it's too expensive, and he needs the money to fund his wars in Italy and against Persia. And then the parts of character assassination where Justinian basically is puppeteering his adopted father, Julian.
You mean Justin?
Sorry, Justin. Sorry.
Yeah.
They all begin with J.
Yes.
Julian.
It's weird.
Not Julian. Justin, sorry. Justin the First. Theodora is an actress and comes from a background of being a prostitute. And then his two his right-hand man, Belisarius, is a sort of over-trusting cuckold, and his wife Antonina is a arch adulteress who manages to hoodwink her husband and get people executed to cover up her.
And again, I mentioned this in our episode because I did, like I said earlier, I did an episode on Belisarius and Antonina with David Parnell a few weeks ago. Actually, last week, I think. And where it seemed to be a common theme in it, in that Chronicles are kind of incels in a way, if you look at it, because they kind of, if there's a strong, powerful woman, she definitely had incest with some former member of her family, because God forbid there is a strong independent woman that we don't want that, do we?
Yeah. Well, in the societies of that time, there were certain certain characteristics that made up a good woman and certain characteristics that made up a bad woman. And I don't think it's any coincidence that the good women are always portrayed in very similar ways.
Yeah.
And then the bad women are always adulteresses, or they're overbearing and dominate their men and stuff like that. And that can also be applied to men as well, where bad men are, they're always off sleeping with people, or they're embezzling money, or they're cruel, or other things like that. And then good men are just, they are kind, they are good warriors, they are faithful to their wives. So it's and we can do that today, where if we look at if a newspaper wants to assassinate the character of a politician, it's very easy to do so. It's like, oh, this person embezzled money, or this person started sleeping with their secretary, or something
and
like that.
And as well, a Johnny Depp trial, for example, comes to mind.
Oh, definitely. So I don't although the minutiae is different, the forms are very similar, which perhaps tells us more about human nature than anything else. But I do. So coming back to Justinian, and Procopius, in terms of critique of Procopius, it's so I know that Professor Parnell, he was keen to there must be more. There is more to Antonina's character than just being an adulteress, and all of that comes from the secret history. So it depends how deeply you believe the secret history is, and if you believe in some bits and not in others, then you should try and justify why that is. And it also, I think he's very keen to point out that the character of Antonina is not entirely that of the adulteress, which is in the secret history, but also the she follows Belisarius on pretty much most of his campaigns. She really helps him out during his campaigns. Like, she goes off,
and they actually travel together as well, which was kind of unique for his time.
Yeah, and she goes off to arrange the reprovisioning of the army with Procopius.
Sorry, Belisarius.
No, with Procopius. So,
really?
I think it's during the siege of Rome. Belisarius sends Procopius and his wife Antonina to Naples to send supplies and reinforcements, which she is essentially in charge of. She and Belisarius deposed the Pope during the siege of Rome. So she is, and in the final campaign of Belisarius in Italy, she is the one that he sends off to the court to try and ask Theodora to persuade Justinian to send more reinforcements and supplies. But unfortunately, Theodora is dead by that point. So certainly she was, whether you believe her, believe the secret history or not, she was certainly very active and helped out her husband when she needed to. And then one must ask, does the character of Antonina that we get from Procopius's History of the Wars match up with his with her portrayal in the secret history? And that also translates to all the other 4 people who are in the firing line in the secret history. So, and I know Caldellus is in, I can't remember what book it is, but
Streams of Gold, Rivers of Scrolls, perhaps?
No, that's about the 10th and 11th century. Is it in a different book? He is talking about Procopius and how we should be skeptical of him as a historical source, but also he can't write the history of the reign of Justinian without him. So being skeptical of your source can only take you so far in some ways. It's difficult, especially when the main source is Procopius.
Yeah.
And it's only on a few occasions that you can compare him with someone like John Malalas to say whether he's telling the truth or not. But then John Malalas was not necessarily an entirely 100% objective source in his own right. There's an occasion where Belisarius is defeated by the Persians, and in Procopius's in Procopius's account, it's the fault of, it's not Belisarius's fault, and then in it's the fault of the officers and the staff in Antioch which are at fault. And then in John Malalas, whose career was in Antioch as a official there, he blames Belisarius. So you've got 2 historians doing the blame game there.
What are your thoughts overall on the Belisarius or Justinian campaign on restoring Italy and restoring the Roman Empire in a way? Because and we discussed this as well in the last episode, and I'll probably take it up again with Caldellus. But I like to have different point of view from different historians. So, what do you think? Did it help the empire, or was it hurtful for the empire in the long run?
It's a question that does come up a lot, and I certainly, whenever I talk about Justinian on my YouTube channel, people are always like, "Oh, Justinian, he blah blah blah, he ruined the empire," and stuff like that. And it's, in some ways, it's 2020 vision in that.
Yeah.
Well, by doing that, he exposed the empire to far more enemies than it originally had back in 527. But firstly, how was Justinian supposed to have known that? Thirdly, it's not the case, I think, it's not the case that as soon as he dies in 565, it's the restored Roman Empire that spans the Mediterranean is doomed to collapse. I know that in the reign of Justin II, you have the Lombards invade Italy, which means that good portions of Italy are lost. And then because of Justin, the next 20 years are spent fighting the Persians because he starts a war with them. But that war is brought to an end, and then by the Emperor Maurice, and then the Emperor Maurice spends the last years of his reign pushing the Slavs and Avars out of the Balkans. And if we're going to say how things had been different about Justinian I, I think we can safely say had things been different with the Emperor Maurice, who's to say that once he pushed them out of the Balkans, he would be unable to hold Italy against the Lombards, who did not conquer the whole of Italy until the 8th century, or northern Italy. In fact, most of the Roman presence on Italy was not completely extinguished until the 11th century.
Yeah.
So, in terms of a lasting conquest, Italy was by far one of Justinian's most lasting legacies, because from when they captured Sicily in the 530s, late 530s.
Don't ask me. You're the historian here.
States. When they captured
That's why
Sicily,
I'm not a historian.
Yes. To when they lost Bari in 1071, that's nearly 500 years. So if it was a decline, it was a very slow decline in terms of their possessions in Italy.
But as we spoke about in our episode of Belisarius and Antonino, as well you had to consider that you had to bring governors in and you had to bring soldiers to protect the area, and that took a tremendous amount from the treasury as well. So you can see the cost of just conquering the territory was easy enough, and sure, you got a lot of treasure, but how long in the long run did that treasure last? Because as we know, Belisarius was kind of corrupt as well, and it took quite a lot of one gold for you, 2 gold for me, 1 gold for you, 2 gold for me, that kind of general, So, and this was quite, of course, common in general of the era, I believe, but still, it costs as well, not just for a treasury that you got in from conquering, but maintaining and, of course, keeping the conquered territories in the long run. It's easy enough to say we conquered the Roman Empire as it was, but it's you needed to keep it and find a way to maintain the conquered territories as well. Yes.
And there is an element of, although they did conquer Africa, Italy, and southern Spain, many of the resources that was gained from conquering them was spent defending them. So there is a lot of fighting in North Africa during the reign of Justinian. There's continuous warfare in southern Spain, although not many troops were sent to southern Spain, so to fight the Visigoths. And then in Italy, the conflict there goes on for many, many years. So and then Italy itself is left completely devastated and depopulated. So the recovery of the region would take decades afterwards, and in some ways would not recover for centuries, because all the big cities have been destroyed or laid waste, or their population have been decimated. So it was very much a lose-lose scenario in some ways. But part of that is because, so Belisarius, you should remember, completes the conquest of Italy. And
doesn't he make an agreement with the Pope at some point? Or is it someone else representative?
don't know.
I think it's Ravenna he comes to, if I remember correctly.
Yes. Yeah, so he gets the Goths to the Ostrogoths to
Yeah. Oh yeah, that's right.
let him into Ravenna. But then the remaining Ostrogoths are very much penned into the very north of Italy, and so had the commanders who were left in Italy had the competency and unity to face the Ostrogoths when they resurged under Totila, then the subsequent war that the Romans fight to reconquer Italy may not have needed to occur in the first place. And part of that, of course, is because of the plague of Justinian, which wipes out a good, at least a fifth of the population of the empire, and probably significantly more. I mean, I'd say a fifth as the lowest estimate. So when you have the taxes, soldiers, administrators, various supplies that were being generated and now aren't, that's going to slow down or make things difficult anyway. And another thing to remember about the plague is it kept recurring every 16 or so years. So there was a recurrence in the reign of Justinian's successors. There were occurrences in the 7th century, and the plague the final recursion of the plague occurs in the middle of the 8th century under the reign of Constantine V. So for nearly 200 years, you have the Black Death coming along and then wiping out a good portion of the population quite regularly. In fact, there's a rather harrowing account by the church historian Evagrius, who was born during the reign of Justinian, and when he was a schoolboy, he caught the plague. But although he managed to survive it, most of his family died from the plague and its various recursions. So, and that's, although that is just one example, if we were to apply that to the many other people in the empire, we could get a glimpse into the finer details, looking at the common people in the empire and how they were affected by the plague, and not just on the geopolitical level.
They did manage to hold on to Sicily for quite a while, and Venice, of course, were though they're more or less semi-independent. They do manage to hold on to Sicily and Venice for quite a while
comes back
after.
to my point about people saying that the reconquests were a waste of time, or because the parts of the empire that Justinian does reconquer become pivotal in the fight for survival in the 7th century against first the Persians and then these Saracens, because it's Sicily and Sardinia and North Africa where they still have substantial territories which, although they are being attacked on occasion, are not quite the war zone that Anatolia turns into. And so there's, under Constans II, he goes to the west, and one of his missions in the west is to reorganize things, and using the wealth and resources of the western provinces, he rebuilds a standing fleet for the empire to fight the burgeoning Arab fleet. And the western half of the empire is very much kind of the fallback point for the empire for the next couple of centuries. For instance, in the second siege of Constantinople by the Arabs, when it's believed that the city has fallen, a emperor is proclaimed, a guy called Basil is proclaimed emperor in Sicily.
This is the first one, right?
No,
Or
this
is
is
it?
this
Oh,
is a
is it
usurper.
Saint?
Basil.
Okay, yeah.
I think it is called Basil Onumeglolos. But this is during the reign of Leo III.
Right, yeah.
And he sends a messenger to Sicily basically saying Constantinople's fine, there's no need to worry, and that basically causes the revolt to dissipate. But it goes to show that Justinian's reconquests in the West had an important part to play in the subsequent couple of centuries when the eastern half of the empire was either conquered or turned into a war zone.
I should add, by the way, I do have a little bit of cold right now, so do forgive me, but I try my best not to cough
quite all right.
more than I have to. But I want to add as well, because Caldelis, under his chapter on this, he seemed to argue that if Justinian had visited these provinces, it may have been a difference. Do you agree there that it could be a difference for the conquered Western territories if Justinian had? Would it not have made a difference if he had visited the newly conquered territories?
Or if he went to visit them in person?
Yeah.
It's difficult to say. The trouble is, in this period of Roman history, most emperors don't visit their provinces, and they don't go campaigning either. So they're very Constantinople bound. And this is something that is set in place after the death of Theodosius, where Arcadius and his successors barely leave Constantinople. Maurice leaves Constantinople once or twice to go on campaign. Theodosius II tries to go to Italy to crown his cousin Valentinian III as emperor, but falls sick and then turns back. But other from that, I don't know of many. Don't know of instances the emperor leaving the city. So, although it's an interesting suggestion in terms of what people would have expected, or I don't see it as an option that Justinian would have thought about that much. So
I don't know.
It's interesting, Justinian's grand tour of the Western provinces, but I don't know what it would have achieved because it didn't happen.
I mean, and again, if I remember correctly, and this is I don't know how much time you have, but I should discuss this forever. But it's something I want to. Oh, hi to the new viewer, by the way. And do you agree that this is kind of the campaign that set up the Great War with Persia, of course, under Heraclius or Heraclion, but whatever you want to say, Heraclius. Do you prefer? Do you agree that this campaign set up the Great War with Khosrow II?
Which campaign? Sorry.
The Great War, or as it's called in the recent book on this topic, the last Great War of Antiquity, if you will put it that way. The Great War in.
Was in. Yeah. Do I think that Justinian's conquests caused the Great War?
That has helped set up the war with Persia.
I don't think so, because the causes of the war weren't to do with the Roman Empire's reconquest of the West. It was far more to do with Persian opportunism, if you like, with the death of Maurice.
So the way I understand this is because they were focused on the West, as some historians believe, that because they had the resources pulled away from the East, and they focused more soldiers on the Western campaign, they were weaker in the East, that allowed Khusro to, sorry if I butcher his name, by the way, but that this allowed him to easier invade the Roman Empire. From what I understand.
My first thoughts are to disagree. In fact, coming back to Anthony Caldelis, he wrote with a compatriot of his a book last year talking about how Justinian, two big points that came out of, he wrote, and his compatriot wrote a book about the Eastern Roman field armies, and the two big points that came out of that for me were, the first is how the Eastern Roman field armies structure changed a lot more than historians previously thought, from a document called the Notitia Dignitatum, because they date it to the 5th century instead of the end of the 4th. And then the second point, which is relevant to this question, is how Justinian supplemented the new armies he created, the army of Armenia, the army of Africa, and the army of Italy, by breaking up the two armies in the emperor's presence, which I think has a lot of clout in it, because by the end of Justinian's reign, he doesn't have much when the nomadic horde attacks the region of Constantinople. There are basically no troops there except for retired veterans and the city guard. So, and if you had the 50 or so thousand praesental troops which are supposed to have been there, then why weren't they involved? And then the simple answer is they had ceased to exist. You could say that there were fewer troops that the Persians may have known about in the East, but I still don't believe that's the case, because the largest field army the Roman Empire had, even after the conquests in the West, was still the army of the East. And it had a sister army, the army of Armenia. Sorry.
That's fine, I'm doing it as well, so you are forgiven.
The big thing that changes is the fact that not only is the Roman Empire destabilized by the death of Maurus and his family, and then the purges that happened afterwards under the reign of Phocas, but also the Romans start fighting a civil war with themselves between Heraclius the Elder and Phocas, who there's fighting in Egypt, and there's the naval threat, because Heraclius sends his son, the future emperor Heraclius, to Constantinople. But there's fighting in Egypt, and Phocas sends troops from the Eastern army to Egypt to fight the supporters of Heraclius the Elder. And so if there's any denuding of the Eastern frontier, it's because of that, which happens towards the end of Phocas's reign. And it's really then that the Persians really start to make ground and start annexing territory, because before that, although they managed to capture a few things, they're not. It's still very piecemeal. But after that point, once the Eastern army starts turning on itself, that the Syrian frontier collapses. So, have to disagree on that one.
Something I want to ask him about as well when it comes to the Great War, and is that do you think that this war helped cause the rise of Islam so rapidly because Rome and Persia were busy fighting each other, of course, during this time, and certain Muhammad comes into the picture and start preaching a new religion? Do you think that because they were so busy at the time that Islam was able to rise so quickly that it did?
Oh, definitely. I don't think there's any doubt about that. In that, I think the Romans, because they had a few years of peace, had a much better recovery than the Persians, who spent the few years between the end of the war and the real beginning of the Arab invasions, fighting a series of civil wars. That the Romans were far better able to challenge the Arabs than the Persians were, but the fact that they are so denuded of troops and money and virtually everything else, that the Arabs are able to have such a impact. And we should remember the sort of measures that Heraclius had to take to fight the Persians, which kind of give us an idea as to how things were when he had to fight the Arabs, and that he had to reduce army pay by half. He had to take precious metals from the church to start minting silver coins to pay civil servants and things like that, because the empire did not have enough gold to mint the solidi needed to pay these people. There's a lot of religious imagery coming out from the War Heraclius's reign. So, like, he puts the cross on his coins and he has the phrase "God help the Romans" on it. And you also start getting apocalyptic text being written during this time. So it's already pretty bleak during the War of Persia, and the Romans are still very much in that situation. They've had a few years to recover, but it's still, you still have outbreaks of the Black Death happening as well, which we shouldn't forget about, which causes issues. So they're still in this quite desperate state when the Arabs appear. So it's little wonder that they are so successful. I mean, also the Arabs themselves did have some very successful generals, whereas I mean, that's another thing you could say, is because of the war, so many people have died. There is a lack of talent in both the Roman and Persian empires, because all the really good people have either died or are kind of overstretched already. So you've just got very junior, very new and inexperienced people in charge. So versus Arabs, which have been quite busy fighting various other Arab tribes in the last years of the time of Muhammad and so on.
Because they paid very little attention to Arabia before the Islamic arrival, didn't they? They mainly paid off the local tribes to fight against each other, and they just kind of worried about left them to themselves in a way.
Well, I think, although again, it's one of those, in hindsight, it becomes a major player, but Arabia was just a kind of tapestry of various different Arabian kingdoms, and if you're the Roman Emperor, you wouldn't think that such
Oh,
a
there's a
power would
new
be capable
relation
of
coming
doing
on.
something.
Definitely
Yes.
should worry about this.
Yeah. The way a modern, it would be like Estonia successfully conquering the whole of Russia today.
Yeah.
No one would think that was possible,
Hmm.
or even consider the possibility of it. And so that's the kind of mindset.
Or I could even
you'd
more
need to
better
think of.
analogy that Ukraine would even go offensive on Russia, as we see right now happening right now.
So, yes, so we shouldn't be too harsh on the Romans for not foreseeing the future. So
something I want to talk a little bit about, and we're going to round it up soon. I know we've been talking for quite a while, and like I said, you probably have other things you want to do, but I want to talk a little bit about sport in the Eastern Roman Empire, because that's something that fascinates me. Because sport, the green and the blue factions were really powerful. I mean, could you imagine if, say, Tottenham, say Manchester, or maybe Chelsea were able to decide who were going to be prime minister in the UK, for example? They did have almost had this power in the sport faction. So that's just how big a deal the Greens and the Blues and the Hippodrome were in the Byzantine world.
Admittedly, it's not a subject I know enough about to go into significant detail. And it is something I would like to learn more about myself. But they are, well, firstly, they are certainly a force. So the Greens and the Blues are two of the four racing factions for the chariot races that go on in the Hippodrome in Constantinople, particularly, but also other major cities have their own hippodromes, and the Greens, Blues, Reds, and Whites also race in those areas. And so lots of regions in the empire have their racing factions and people they support. I was mentioning how there was a civil war in Egypt during the rebellion of Heraclius the Elder, and part of the two of the sides that get involved in that are the Greens and the Blues, in that they start supporting Phocas and Heraclius. So they play quite instrumental roles in various periods in the empire, like also during the Nika riots. They are heavily involved in that, and also the Emperor Maurice calls upon the racing factions to help defend the capital from Phocas. So
it was also in the Hyperdome that usually, if you had the civil war, or if you were proclaiming a new emperor, that is where the almost for lack of better, the crowning happened. Of course, the real crowning was in Hagia Sophia, but it wasn't the Hyperdome. The people kind of chose. That's how Justin came to power, right?
Justin the First. That was.
Wasn't that how he was proclaimed emperor in the Hippodrome by the people? From what I understand.
Yes, he took the money he was meant to use to bribe a bunch of the people and palace guard units to proclaim this other chap, emperor, and he got them to proclaim him emperor instead. Yes. But I think that they were an everyday thing. So you had people who had particular clothes to wear during the races, and paraphernalia with them. They were organized in like a club, if you like, So, and they were made up of people from all strata of society, from wealthy people to very poor people. So, in a sense, perhaps one of the reasons why they're so influential is because you had that an organized body of people united by their racing faction.
I mean, like I said, could you imagine if that happened today? Like they decided, sport faction decided who the prime minister should be.
Well, you need to hand out a pretty sufficient bribe to do that, I suppose. But to get all of your Arsenal fans to try and storm Parliament or something like that. But yes, it shows. I think it shows how people could be mobilized, both in a social and political way. But we shouldn't forget that these were still primarily sports factions. That you have the few instances of them being involved in big political events, but in day-to-day life, they'd be at the Hippodrome cheering on the Greens or the Whites or the Blues. The Greens and the Blues come up so much because they were the two big teams, whereas the Reds and the Whites were the less popular, less funded, more obscure teams.
I think it's time we kind of ran up now, but I want to ask before we go. And I have a few questions that comes to mind. If there is, of course, quite a few emperors that lack biographies that probably deserves biography, and if you wish that there's one or two emperors that or empresses that should have a biography, who would you choose that you feel deserves a biography?
That's I would very much like I very much like a really detailed study of I mean,
I can begin with my choices because I would like to see one on Basil II. As far as I know, there's no biography on him yet, and of course, Irene and Zoe would be interesting.
There's one by Catherine Holmes. It's called Basil II and the Governance of Empire, which I recommend.
Check that out.
It's kind of a book in two halves. In that the first half is analyzing the main historian we have for his reign, John Skylitzes, and then the second half is examining the other facets of his reign, or the facets of his reign.
Also, I think Irene and Zoe would really deserve a biography of their own as well.
The Empress Irene,
and Zoe, I think.
There have been, although I don't think there's a specific book about her, there have been some quite detailed studies of her reign, sorry. There's the historian Warren Treadgold, who wrote from the Byzantine revival, and he covers the Empress Irene, the Constantine VI, Nicephorus I, Stauracius, Michael I, Leo V, and Michael II, and Theophilus in quite a lot of detail.
Have you thought about your answer to the question? Someone you would like to see a biography on?
About that. Although there has been a biography written about him, I think it would be very interesting to have a new biography written about Romanus I. There is a very old biography written about him by Sir Stephen Runciman back in the 1920s. But I think because of how the study of the 10th century has progressed and new additions, a better understanding of the sources, and a how the field has changed in that time. A new biography about him could not only be very helpful, but also in kind of better understanding his reign. But I think raise his profile a bit, because I think he's a very good emperor, but is a bit more obscure because he's right at the beginning of what becomes the Byzantine Golden Age, rather than
Listen,
someone like Basil.
I just don't know how to
right in the middle.
end this real quickly. I'm sorry for the quick ending, but I'm just gonna end this real quickly, and I'll be right back. I'm so sorry for the ending so quickly, but thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time.
Thank you very much.
I just